So, given these tensions between these two competing values, so we have free speech on the one hand and privacy on the others, what are we to do? In some sense, we can recognize that if we fail to act, there are a lot of really terrible things that might happen. And yet, it seems incredibly difficult to figure out what to do in ways that preserve what we care about in both cases. Now, when we're reading the DeLove piece on the future of reputation, he thinks that one of the really fundamentally important tasks for us, if we're thinking about this tension, is that we tend to sort of think about privacy and free speech as these sorts of just singular things that we care about and their intention, and we throw up our hands because what can we do? This is useless. That's hopeless, right? And he thinks that actually a more useful strategy is to think about why we care about both. So when we examine the justifications and like, what is privacy for? Why do we even care about privacy? And we do the same for free speech. He thinks it's helpful in this case that a lot of the reasons that we value them are actually overlapping. So when we, it seems, I think, important to both free speech and privacy, this connection with autonomy. Or, this idea that like we need, for democracy, right? I think if people are going to actually deliberate about things that are sort of matter to them, they also probably need some kind of space to do so in a reasonable way outside the influences of other people. And so both of these are sort of really fundamentally important components. So that's that autonomy and democracy are really fundamental components of our justifications for both of these. But DeLove suggests that what that might mean is that we actually just sort of need to move the discussion and shift it a level up so that we're actually talking not about privacy and free speech, but thinking about how to construct law in such a way that we are sort of making sure to focus on autonomy and the value of democracy rather than focusing over much on this particular conflict that seems unresolvable. He thinks that if we move a level up, it's actually quite helpful for us to be conceptualizing how to carve out the space between them and different ways of doing that. And I think he had some interesting suggestions in the chapters that we read. And I'm curious as well what you thought about those. So did you agree with him about his particular recommendations? So one of the most, I think, important recommendations that he had, and here I'm kind of lumping different solutions together, was what I would think of as the did you try to protect privacy? Do you seem to care about privacy kind of consideration? In that he thinks that we can build this into law that so long as people are making good faith efforts to try to protect people's privacy as much as possible, then in some sense they shouldn't be held liable if someone else is like, but I don't like it. So the idea is that if you're writing a novel and you have to sort of share your story, you should change the names and certain details that maybe don't matter so that you're not providing identifiable information. So attempting to withhold identifying information is going to be one way that you can indicate that, like, no, I'm caring about the people's privacy involved, but of course, I want to be able to tell my story. The other thing is that on a commercial level, it could be particularly important for people to respond to complaints or legitimate worries when they receive them. That if you're a blogger and someone points out that on your blog there is a comment that is really damaging to them and, that like they don't want on there, unless you really do feel that it has this sort of newsworthy component or that this is about the commenter's ability to tell their story, it seems reasonable to say that unless you take it down after you've been notified, you could become complicit in some of the harms. So that's one of the suggestions that he's made, and these are really, I think, both subsumed under this same idea of, are you, like the individual speaker or the person who's sort of hosting speech, trying to make this balance in the reasonable way? Like, are you gesturing towards a concern for privacy, even if it's the case that you ultimately sort of come down on the side of free speech? And so that's why I think of it as kind of a did you try or do you care clause, because it needn't necessarily be tracking certain kinds of actual actions taken in some sense, but it's more of, I think, a good clause, absence of malice kind of approach to this. And you might worry that that's insufficient, but I'm curious to see what other people had to say about this. The other argument that he makes is that he thinks that it is also important for people to have... So he thinks that it should be both easier and less consequential for people to make privacy torts. That, it shouldn't be so financially devastating for people to do it. But in some sense, it maybe should be easier to win a case that's like that. So I was curious what you all thought about his particular recommendations. I think his book is notable in that while he does a really good job of laying out these different kinds of competing considerations, he does have some very concrete recommendations for how he thinks the law should be changed in order to balance them. And I'm curious what you have to think about that.